Hello. Today I am giving an ode to tears and stating the case why I think tears are underrated in today's society and why we should honor them more than we do, in my opinion at least. So, where's this coming from? I think that I really didn't like the concept of tears or crying or any of those sorts of things. And I've come to change my mind. So, I'm sharing my journey on the internet, see if it resonates with anyone. So, the things I'll talk about today have three bits. So, the first bit is unraveling why did I resist tears, or in general, like the question, like, where does this kind of fear or resistance towards tears come from? The second one is contemplating why they might be good. And the third bit is around caution and what's things to consider. So, yes, it's good, but what's the cautionary tale one should tell at the same time? So, if we start with part one, resistance, this is how I conceptualize why I might have resisted tears and maybe it resonates. So, the first bit is that I think that tears, kind of in a weird way, they're actually really terrifying and they're really scary because it confronts us with our most vulnerable parts and nearly like the childlike parts of our psyche and ourselves. And I think that in some degree, one, that's not very recognized in society, but two, I think it's exceptionally terrifying because it's really surrendering to our own vulnerability. That's at least, yeah, that's a theory. So, kind of part one is around it's really actually really scary. It takes, I think, a tremendous amount of courage to be able to cry and to kind of get into that state of vulnerability to let things go. But I think it reminds us of being really helpless and like childlike, or at least that's what it does with me to some degree. The second piece, I think, is that I don't know, my experience of society is that tears aren't necessarily looked well upon, even though, I might have had parents that would say things like, let it out. It's always better to let it out than to bottle it up. But that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't other messaging that gets picked up, like, cry baby is something that kids call each other, which kind of means that if you're crying, you're a baby, or which means that tears are juvenile and therefore something to be looked down upon because that's kind of the message that's coming across, or the delightful boys don't cry that I think is said so many times to young men. But that kind of also implies that there's something to be looked down upon if one needs to cry, which I think is really interesting. So I think from a society perspective, maybe it's, similar to the previous one where it's like individually we're afraid of our vulnerability. Maybe in society we're afraid of that too. And tears is the image of that vulnerability. So any person that's portraying that is ultimately rejected in an interesting way. It's just a theory, but an interesting one, I think. And then personally, this was like I think my biggest resistance. I was really afraid of kind of my tears and my grief because I thought that it was like infinite. That if I would surrender to it and if I would start crying, that I would never stop. That I would fall into this rabbit hole of feelings that was infinite. And therefore, I didn't even want to start touching the well because it was just too scary. And I guess I wondered to what degree that applies to other people too. So it's just this fear of, if you go there, it's the feeling that you can never come back and that it just kind of swallows you whole. That was part of what kind of my big resistance to tears was the fear that if I went there, I could never come back or catch myself again. Anyway, I have since learned differently, but let's go to the benefits and talk about, at least from my perspective, or some of the beautiful things people have said. So maybe this is the ode part of the ode. So the first bit is, which is something really beautiful that somebody said to me, was that if our eyes are the windows to the soul, then tears are our abilities to wipe them clean. So the way that I understood that, which I thought was really beautiful, was kind of to say that we have a specific lens and a specific perspective that we look out into the world, and that lens can become quite fixed sometimes. So kind of tears nearly allow you to wash that lens and have a new perspective that you maybe didn't have yesterday. At least in my experience, that I definitely resonates. That kind of, once you've faced the tears and you allow them to kind of come up and process and really like cry all of them out, I find for myself that there's often like a change in perspective, which can be super helpful once I allow it to happen. It just takes a huge amount of courage and some time, which I don't always have the patience for, let's be honest. But anyway, the second piece, which is an analogy I really like, is kind of speaking to, I think that sometimes, our lives are like soil, and tears, in a way, like tears come up when we grieve something, when we say goodbye to something, when we have to let something go, whatever that might be. But there is kind of an element of sadness, and or that ultimately is the expression of tears. But in my experience, kind of, I conceptualize tears as kind of the water that we can nurture the soil of our lives with. And if we do that, then often, after the grief is processed and after we've cried, then often kind of new, beautiful things can emerge out of our life because we've kind of let go and surrendered the thing that we didn't need anymore. So that's kind of another way of saying, maybe tears, at least in my own experience, they help me let go so that I can kind of start afresh and start anew once I let them, not once I let that happen. And the last bit is kind of more like from a physiological perspective. I feel like there's something really good about tears, and I haven't done the research, and maybe somebody in the comments one day will comment on it. But I feel like, in crying, like if you're really crying and you're sobbing and your like body is shaking, that there's like, for me, there's nearly a release from that. It's like there's so much stress that leaves my system because I've let the tears come out. And then, once it's all processed, it's like sometimes I feel like a new person. Like I feel so much more energy. I feel so rejuvenated. I mean, it takes a bit of time, as my first bit of advice. It's not immediate, and it really means going kind of to the bottom of the well before that feeling comes up. But once it happens, it really is like a rejuvenation, like a new way of looking at life. So I guess my note to self and to anyone else that needs to hear it, speaking to my first resistance of infinity, is that it definitely isn't infinite. Once you have the courage to face it, eventually the well runs dry, and eventually you've kind of cried everything out, at least for that moment in time. And it does come to an end. It isn't infinite, at least in my experience. The thing I did want to mention though is that there is some cautionary tales or some things to look out for, because I think when you do need to cry and let something go and kind of go into that really vulnerable state, first off, it's really, really important to keep in mind that there is a time and a place. Like, do it in a place where you feel safe and in a time where you have time to do so. Because what's really bad is if you go into that really vulnerable place and you're somewhere or in some situation where you won't be held, and then it can be kind of counterintuitive and very traumatizing and actually make everything worse. So you want to do it in a place where you can actually really feel held and comforted. So there's a time and a place. Some times and places are just not as helpful as others. So kind of, if you can, be thoughtful about it. Top tip, top tip. There's a time and place for everything. And similarly, there's kind of who you go to when you're in this vulnerable state and you're wanting support also really matters. So my notes to self is kind of, number one is often go to somebody that isn't necessarily directly linked to what you're processing or what you're hurting about. What I found on average is that people can hold space for you if they feel non-responsible. Then it's really easy to hold space. And if you just say, I just need you to hold me for half an hour and I just need to process this, this has nothing to do with you. My husband is really receptive to that, and that's really easy for him to hold space to. But if I'm like mad at him and crying about something that I'm blaming him for, then that's exceptionally hard and also completely unreasonable, let's be honest. So who you go to and how you go to them really matters. And similarly, yeah, to that point is there's a very different ask if you're asking, can you just hold me? Or I want to blame you for this. If you just ask, I want to be held and I just need to process this, my experience is that people are generally very receptive. If you want to have a cry and blame somebody at the same time, they generally shut down and it becomes quite dramatic and not a good time. So, would not recommend, highly don't recommend doing that. Have done it, didn't work out in my favor. And the last piece is kind of, I think, the downside, which I think is also dangerous, which can happen, is that tears can be used as a form of manipulation. So to use emotions to make somebody feel shitty about themselves or to get your way, which is kind of quite, like, I think in that instance, that can be quite not helpful for everyone in the situation. So I think it really makes sense to honor our feelings and to feel them and to allow space for them to process, but do it in such a way that we still allow the people opposite us to also have their feelings and their experience, and not necessarily manipulate them into our world and our reality. I have done this and it did not work in my favor, so that's why I highly don't recommend. But I also think that that might be part of giving like tears, quote unquote, a bad rap. Like, oh man, how many men I've heard say, like, as soon as the wife cries, then, the argument's over because, she's going to get her way or something like that. And I think in that case, there's like an element of, we're no longer meeting each other. But yeah, I don't know if that's particularly helpful. Anyway, that's my cautionary tale on, I think, tears for the sake of processing, for the sake of healing, for the sake of letting go are really beautiful, and tears for sake of manipulating and controlling and hurting, or unintentionally trying to do that, may not. So yeah, be curious about what you're doing in the moments. So this is my ode to tears, but I'm really curious what kind of you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What's your experience? Have you cried? And I was like, should we motivate that, seeing a man cry is actually like such a good sign, because it means that they have the courage to face their feelings. And maybe that's something we as a society should celebrate more, when men are vulnerable and when they trust us enough with these deep feelings, can we also hold space for them? I don't know. Is it a green flag question to the internet at large? Anyway, I hope that this was interesting and useful to you, and I wish you a lovely day. Cheerio.